Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are honored that you are with us again. Tonight, we're going to focus on whose Assyria is it? Contested national stories. And we're going to focus on the academy or scholarship in the West in particular. It's also had influence on scholarship in the East. By the way, the convention or the gathering for Assyriology is going to take place this coming year in April, and it's going to be in Baghdad for the first time in history. So Assyriologists from all over the world are gathering, and they're going to be in Baghdad. And as far as I know, there's only one Assyrian participating from the scholars giving talks, and that is Assyriologist Shana, who's currently in Europe. She's an Assyriologist in Europe teaching there. So welcome to tonight's program. We'll be talking about that giving you more information before that takes place. And I'm sure there's going to be, unlike in the years before, somebody's going to be talking about continuity of Assyrian history and after the fall, because scholars are finding out more and more after the fall of the Assyrian Empire. Not everything collapsed as earlier thought by many of the Western scholars who dispute the continuity of the Assyrian people. So there's bound to be a certain number of scholars who are going to probe that question from their scholarly perspectives. Now, having said that, I want to pose a question to Pierre. Unfortunately, Ms. Sarah Go is not able to join us today. She is focused on her schooling, and she has, I believe, exams right now. So I'm going to pose a question to Mr. Pierre Yonan, who is nice enough to join, and who is joining us from Morbishu, I believe. The background scene that Pierre has are the beautiful villages, perhaps the most beautiful in the Assyrian heartland of Morbishu. Pierre, a question for you. Assyrian history, particularly ancient Assyrian history, and even one could say medieval Assyrian history or classical Assyrian history, as described by many scholars, classical Syriac history, has been told by the West, and it's largely lost to us as modern Assyrians. And it's told by Western scholars in various universities of the world, and now in Eastern universities as well, somewhat. It's told to us by Iraqi archaeologists who are getting on social media and on various channels and in various interviews and telling the Assyrian story, and by Syriac specialists, one could say. And they have their own interests. They have their interests in terms of their disciplines. They have their interests in terms of Iraqi archaeologists and, for example, Turkish archaeologists and Syrian archaeologists tell their story from an interest-based perspective. There's interest in, of course, in the subject matter. This is an important subject matter for Syria, for Turkey, for Iraq in particular. And they tell it from the perspective of also being interested in tourism and having cultural value from the Assyrian past, which is classified and fragmented into Turkish, Syrian, or Iraqi. Against these movements, what is the responsibility of the Assyrian people as they are dispersed all over the world, from your perspective?
Yeah, I think our responsibility is to continue to preach our truth in this sense. Obviously, you brought up Iraqi archaeologists. They have their certain goals. Many of them, unfortunately, scholarship is biased in many regards with national interest to say, look, this is part of ancient Iraqi civilization. And same is said in Turkey. Look at, Turkey is where we see some of the oldest civilizations on planet Earth, they say, when they discover something in North Mesopotamia. And the same can be said, for Kurds who attempt to label things as, their own in many cases. it's important for Assyrians to remain vocal in this sense and to say, let's be honest about what history says. Let's be honest and say what more unbiased scholars might say about this. And say, okay, well, Iraq is a modern creation, Turkey is a modern creation, Syria is a modern creation. These are all modern nation states. They exist. Their borders are superimposed over geographic considerations and all these things. And it's important for Syrians to recognize this and to understand that, we don't have to say, we're a part of this idea called Iraq or something like that. The borders were superimposed upon us, if anything. And that's something I often think is a responsibility for us, is to continue this conversation and to continue to be vocal about how we feel that we are connected to this heritage, that this is part of our heritage, and that to continue to display that. Social media is a powerful tool in raising these discussions and having these things be heard. I think even when people go to university and one of these archaeologists are teaching, plenty of foreign archaeologists are brought to universities in America and Europe. It's important to even express your beliefs to these professors as well. Robert, you brought up a story to me before about when you were at University of Illinois, and there was a professor who said, Nestorians, so-called Assyrians, you confronted him on it and having that discussion with him and bringing the plight of the Assyrian people, the intellectual cause of the Assyrian people, to the forefront. And I think that's really our responsibility. I mean, obviously, we can't sit and change the agenda of Iraq. We can't change the agenda of Turkey. We can't change the agenda of Kurds. They want to tell their own story, and they want to, put this as part of their history of their nation state. But at the end of the day, it's our job to remain honest in these discussions.
Very good. Thank you for that. Now, I want to ask you a follow-up question since Sarah is not here. Okay, so you said our truth. To what extent, and that presumes that the Assyrians know their history, to what extent do Assyrians have a responsibility to learn their history very carefully, whether it's modern history, whether it's ancient history, classical history? To what extent does the average Assyrian who lives in Chicago or Australia or anywhere else have a responsibility to internalize and keep and hone and improve that knowledge of ancient Assyria, or classical Assyria, or modern Assyria, and the continuity of Assyrian history? To what extent?
That's a great question. That's a great question, Robert. One of the things to be said about that is look at every other nation state that exists, country that exists. Their educational system always put an emphasis on teaching history. That's something that's always a required course in, when you're young, when you're in middle school, when you're in high school, when you're in university. In America, we have gen eds that you require some history education as well in college, so that Americans can be aware of their history. Americans can say, oh, this is what happened. Slaves were freed at this point. The Constitution was made in this point. This is why we celebrate July 4th. Obviously there's going to be uneducated Americans who don't know this. I'm not going to sit and say every American knows this, but the job of the educational system is to attempt to have every American to know this. In the same way, Assyrians do also have a requirement to attempt to learn these things, absent of a nation state. To be aware of your history is to be aware of who you are, why you are here, and what is important in terms of these things, studying our language, our culture, our church, knowing all these developments. And if you don't know these things, you're lost. Frankly, if you don't try to know these things, you're somewhat lost. I'm sure many people are wondering, why are, younger Assyrians, why are we here in America? We're not white Americans, we have our own language and culture. Why are we here? It's important to understand genocide, the history of the church. It's important to understand classical Assyria. Why are we called Assyrians? It's important to understand the ancient heritage. All these things go into knowing yourself. I often think to people who get very interested in history often start reflecting into their own familial lineage, and going through family trees and whatnot, because again, to know one's history is to know oneself better. And I think, again, every Assyrian has a duty to do that, just as any member of a nation state has a duty to learn their history to some degree. We shouldn't force history onto everyone. This is everyone should be naturally curious to some amount on their own. Um, that's what I would say.
Okay, that's a good answer. And then I also want to ask you, but I'll wait until the end. So, who produces our history? Who's going to tell us what our history should be? Oh, dear priest from Moravishu, Pierre. Well, I say that because you have Moravishu in the background. So, who?
If you want me to answer this now or at the end.
I think hold off. Hold off. I'm going to come back to this, and we'll pose it to the rest of the class as well, because we're going to go through a couple of examples. So let me begin by posting the images that you see on the screen. Whose Assyria is it? On the left hand is a photograph of the Assyrians who helped dig up the winged bulls. Layard famously said that he hired Nestorian Chaldeans from the mountains. Of course, he was talking about the Hakkari people living in the Hakkari area, who lived in Tiari and Huma, more specifically in Tiari, and he used them because they were, according to Layard, more physically strong, and they could dig up and carry larger pieces of stone versus the Arabs, who were put in charge of digging the earth and taking soil out from these ruins, which were covered. And so you see the image there. A lot of Assyrians are pictured with their conical caps or conical hats from, in particular, Tiari. There are many tales about the Assyrians of Tiari coming down to the area of Nineveh from their mountains to make a living by engaging in this very physically demanding work. Now, how much they knew about their ancient past, of course, this was the first time for thousands of years that the world's eyes fell upon these images of grand palaces and their artistic works. People had not seen these lamassus, for example, and the grandeur of these palaces. So how much they knew about this history is a question, but largely it is answered by various accounts that not much, because their training, if there was any training in history, it was focused on biblical or Christian history rather than in history of the saints and so forth, rather than ancient Assyrian history. The picture in the middle is of a professor at the Oriental Institute, then the Oriental Institute, now ISAC, showing the winged bull, which was carried from Khorsabat or Dur Sharrukin, and that's the image that you see to the left. That's Khorsabat, where Assyrians were digging. Modern Assyrians were digging up their ruins to be sent to the west. And so in the center are Western curious onlookers. On the right is a little Iraqi girl in the Iraqi Museum looking at ruins from the very same city, from Dur Sharrukin. And one way you could tell that these are Dur Sharrukin statues, the citadel of Sargon, or Sargon city, Sargon II city, is that they were much grander than the architecture and the artistic works of Sennacherib, the time of Sennacherib, who was in Nineveh, or Sarhaddon or Ashurbanipal. Their works were smaller compared to the works produced by Sargon II. By the way, if you go to the Oriental Institute, you'll see many of the reliefs that were done in Sargon's palace, now resting at the Oriental Institute, or now ISAC. And another part of the very same set of reliefs is now in the Louvre Museum in Paris, France, and also in Baghdad. So a lot of these artifacts and great artistic works have been taken out and sent into different places to the south, to Baghdad, to Paris, and to the British Museum as well, and to the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago. So let's talk about what's the national story. I asked this question of like, well, who tells the national story? The national story must be told. It just also depends on who tells it. It's a socially constructed account of a people's shared past and often present and future. Here we are in the past. This is our experience. This is where we're going. We're going nowhere, or we're about to do great things. And you could see this repeated in many examples in the present and in the past. Um, Intended to forge an identity, legitimize political claims, and give coherence to the who we are. Who are we talking about? It's made up of selective memories, okay, symbols, myths, institutions, and discourses. What is emphasized and what is omitted, how events are interpreted, is the question for the elites and the teachers and the museums and the universities that propagate this knowledge. We need to ask how it's created and by whom. Okay, who creates this story and what is it created for? So before we begin talking about how Iraqis understand, for example, Iraqi archaeologists and Iraqi writers and Arab nationalists and Kurdish nationalists understand Assyrian history, let's talk about when these items began to be uncovered and began to be understood and began to be deciphered and so on and so forth. So we know that in 19th century, Europeans began to dig a lot of these items. Layard, of course, we've heard. Bota is another one. There are various archaeologists who dug up these great sculptures, dug up these palaces, and they really, I should say this because many Assyriologists are saying this today, that they disregarded, the continuity of history. They were looking for the bling bling. They were looking for the majestic statues and sculptures and reliefs of the ancient Assyrians, and they disregarded what came later. They weren't really looking at the Parthian period, for example, or the Achaemenid period, or the Sasanian period, or the Arab period. They just dug very deep, looking for what they felt were these actually very high valued items. And these did not disappoint, of course, as you see in the drawing to the right there, the winged bull. This was obviously a very majestic sculpture in granite or in marble or gypsum. And these were very beautiful, and they were carried out because they had high cultural value. They were high art. And these discoveries were interpreted largely through biblical and an Orientalist lens. Assyria was ancient, extinct civilization. Its story was told by the Bible, and it was really about despotism, and it was particularly Oriental despotism. It was about decay of the East and so on and so forth. It also really effectively erased the continuity of the Assyrians. It saw a major rupture with the fall of Nineveh and did not really look to the Assyrian people. There were vague references at times. Layard mentioned that these people were as much part of the ruins of Assyria as the sculptures, the winged bull sculptures, for example, that were dug up from these lands. But there was really no interest in understanding the continuity of Assyrian history. For example, there was no deep understanding of why these people called themselves this term Suraya and later Athuraya. So this move allowed Europe to claim the right to interpret Assyria's past while really ignoring the living legacy of Assyria. Now, modern states, such as Iraq, and then later, of course, Turkey and Syria, became the inheritors These antiquities and these artifacts and these very, of course, valuable items that came from the ground became nationalized, became the properties of these countries, and began to be telling the stories of each of these countries in a rather fragmented way. So they became Iraqi, or they became Turkish in effect. It's a part of Turkey's legacy, and caters to tourism in Turkey and Kurdistan, of course, the Kurdistan region. Kurdistan is not a country, of course, but it is a region. And the Kurds take a lot of pride in, and there's a kind of ambiguous relationship with Assyrian ruins there. They try to kind of codify the existence of these people as if, like, okay, we have ancient Kurdistan and we have many layers of civilizations. It's not quite, fully Assyrian. Assyrians are one part of this civilizational march, as it were. So there were Sumerians and Babylonians and the Mitanni and the Parthians, and on and on. And this is all part of the Mesopotamian Kurdistan history, as it were. And so really there was a reframing of Assyrian history before one could say the move on the part of the Assyrians began late in the 19th century and early 20th century, to understand, to digest, to begin to teach this connection to the ancient past. So the continued use of the Assyrian language, for example, or Aramaic, which was the lingua franca of Assyria by modern Assyrians, was ignored and framed as Syriac Christianity, unconnected to ethnicity. And it's a bit shocking today to see how this became a major rupture for people. They could not see that Suraya and Suraya Athuraya were really somehow connected. And so there was this big to do about, oh, these people were Syriac, and now they think they're Assyrian, as if the two words had absolutely nothing to do with each other and were superimposed on this region. So Western scholars categorize modern Assyrians solely as a religious group. By the way, this is also noticed from many Turkish scholars now. I asked one Turkish scholar who has recently written about a feud within the Marshamun family back in Qutanos, about the feud with the Numrud side of the Marshamun family. And the reference to our people is constantly Nestorian. Nestorian this, Nestorian that, Nestorian patriarch, Nestorian church, Nestorian people. And the scholars, when asked, the scholars said, well, we had no choice. Now, what that means exactly, I'll leave that up to you. The museum and the archive, ancient Assyrian artifacts are taken to various cities. They are taken to Paris, London, Chicago, of course, as symbols of Western kind of caretaking of these items rather than really telling of an Assyrian history. And major Assyriologists such as Olmsted and Sags and Rue, and even later figures like Eckhard Fromm, discuss Assyria as kind of a empire that's dead, and its legacy is really, if there is a legacy there, it's really empire building, not really a peoplehood, not really nationhood, not really kind of a cultural continuity of people. And in one of our conversations with an Assyriologist, I was told by this Assyriologist, a particular Assyrian, I'm not going to mention the name because it was a private correspondence, but I was told, my specialty is on the ancient Assyrians before the fall of Nineveh, not the community to which you belong. So as if the two are, to paraphrase one of the sayings, east is east and west is west, and the twain shall never meet. So the ancient Assyrians are separate from the modern Assyrians, and the two are completely separate. And, according to my profession as an Assyriologist, I have nothing to do with your community. I'm focused on something frozen in time, and it has no connection whatsoever to you. So when modern Assyrians are mentioned, it's usually the interest is missionary context and not historical continuity, which I believe, and I'm going to argue this very forcefully, is a failure on the part of scholarship. Now, some people can say it's intentional. In certain instances, one could make that argument, but I believe by and large it's a failure of the Western academic tradition of constantly fragmenting and specializing and over specializing in particular areas and not seeing the whole, as if you have various medical doctors focused on particular parts of the body without seeing the connectedness to seeing continuity with the human body. The eyes are completely separate from the head. The neuro system is completely separate, when in fact there is a lot of connection there in the human body. And doctors nowadays are so focused on their specialties that they forget the relationship between these various parts of the human body. And so I think in the Western tradition, the focus on specialization has taken away from understanding the bigger picture as far as the Assyrians are concerned. Now, the irony of custodianship: Western powers displaced Assyrians through colonial boundaries and political deals. The Sykes Picot basically put the Assyrians into three different or four different countries, newly created countries. And then they could say, well, this is Iraq, and you people were from Turkey and you came into Iraq, as if the borders, the Assyrians had crossed the borders, but in fact, the borders had crossed the Assyrians, in effect, so to say. And so these states oppressed or erased the Assyrians as custodians of the Assyrian past. In doing so, they reproduced a colonial logic. The natives are to be studied, not to study themselves. And I have to tell you, a lot of times we contribute to this idea of that we cannot really study ourselves. We should rely on others to study us because we are not capable of understanding. It was said by one of the scholars who long time ago contacted the Assyrian Academic Society and said something like this, and I'm paraphrasing, and I think it was really interesting that he said this. He said, basically, you people collect data and give it to us. Collect whether we're talking about dialects or you're talking about artifacts, or you're talking about artifacts such as written works and things like that, letters and correspondence and so on and so forth, and just give it to us. Let us do the analyzing, let us do the understanding, let us do the comprehending and the writing about what it is that you've discovered. The result is that the Assyrian continuity becomes politically inconvenient. To recognize it would undermine nationalist narratives of Iraq, Turkey, and the KRG, and also expose Western complicity in these narratives. So a truly critical, decolonial, and I would say comprehensive and coherent approach. I use this word decolonial because decolonizing, because it's been used, but to recognize Assyrians as an indigenous people that have a claim on these artifacts, that have something to say about these artifacts, and that come from that land and have been dispossessed by various waves of conquest, including at last the splitting of these lands into fragments where Assyrians from Iran and Assyrians from Turkey and Assyrians from Syria and Assyrians from Iraq understand themselves to be completely separate from each other. The challenge the Eurocentric narrative that separates ancient Assyria from modern Assyria. As we said, the Assyriologist who said, I study ancient Assyria, that has nothing to do with the community you belong to, as if there's, again, no contact with the ancient Assyrians. Question how museums, governments, and academic disciplines serve power, deciding who owns antiquity and who merely descends from it. So I think it's important to have these discussions, and I think Assyrians are intelligent enough and capable enough and wise enough to be able to decipher many of these issues. Now, again, to go back, what is a national narrative? So part of this is we're talking about, again, an imagined community. To go back to kind of a theoretical basis, Benedict Anderson had argued this. He's not talking about Assyrians, he's talking about all peoples. He's talking about all nationalisms and nations, how they formed. So it is an imagined community. The national narrative, the story that we tell about ourselves, as if almost like a religious tale or a religious book, okay, binds that imagination and binds people together. Invented traditions and myths. The narratives include invented or ritualized traditions, myths, heroic ancestors, Qatina Gabara, Gilgamesh. These help provide continuity, legitimacy, often linked to ancient or mythic pasts to legitimize a people's identity. So when we say we're talking about Gilgamesh, we're talking about the winged bull. Here you see in the photograph, for example, an Assyrian team, the winged bull in Chicago. That was a tremendous team, a soccer team that won many matches and became very famous. And they always carried, of course, the image of the winged bull with them. And who doesn't recognize, who's an Assyrian, who doesn't recognize this image of the winged bull, which, by the way, is being used by the Iraqi military today. So there's also selective memory involved, what is included versus what is suppressed. We remember some things, we forget other things. Symbols, monuments, and public education, flags, national museums, curricula, monuments. I'm glad to say that Chicago has a couple of monuments now commemorating the Assyrian past, specifically the genocide, and that's a great thing, and hopefully there will be others. Holidays, so for example, Chab Nisan, Martyrs' Day, now have a prominent place among Assyrians. Political utility, elites, political, religious, and intellectual, often craft or promote national narratives to legitimize power, define membership, who is the us, who is the them, and integrate diverse populations or people, or mobilize people. Now, in the Assyrian case, of course, when we use this word, we refer to the various segments of the Assyrian people, some who sort of agree with it and some who don't. Now, you might say, well, how do you count someone who doesn't agree as an Assyrian? Well, we'll get to that eventually, but what we're talking about is the kind of the underlying classifications that one defines if one is an Assyrian. For example, the language one speaks, the area one comes from, the geographic area, the demography one comes from, the culture that one engages in or expresses, the customs that one has, the churches that one belongs to, and so on and so forth. Now, these narratives are often contested. So, for example, you will have one particular bishop and one particular church saying, hold on, Nineveh is not where we come from. We like Babylon more. Or let's not talk about Nineveh or Assyria. Let's talk about Aram instead, because that's a more biblically appropriate term. Or let's talk about Ur of the Chaldees, for example. That is more appropriate for us as Christians. Now, how are these narratives created? Who creates them? Now, typically, there are state institutions that are very powerful and rich that produce, for example, textbooks. There are museums, there are national archives, ministries of culture, et cetera, who produce official history, such as the case in the United States, which is now being contested sometime or has been for some time. You know, you'll see books like history that your parents never told you about, or your teacher never told you about this American history. Political elites and national leaders, presidents, monarchs, revolutionary leaders who promote certain narratives, often in a speech, propaganda, official ceremonies. Think about Ashur Yusuf, for example, an intellectual, a historian, a writer, an activist, Think about Binyamin Arsanis. Think about Freydun Bit Oraham or Freydun Athuraya. Think about Hakim Baba Parhad, and on and on. Ade Alkhas, John Alkhas, Hannibal Alkhas, all these people, poets, historians, artists, creating and shaping this narrative of the Assyrian people. They pass it on, and then you have a grassroots movement, folk memories, local histories, minority groups, minority group remembrance, oral traditions. These may align or conflict with other versions. So, for example, this celebration of the Assyrian New Year that was originally written up by people like Nimrod Simono and John Alkhas, and then taken over by a political group and then passed on to the public. Now you have demonstrations and marches in Khabnisan, for example, in Duhok, Iraq, and in Chicago and California, and so on. You also have external influences. You have colonial powers, foreign archaeologists, missionary schools, media, diaspora communities, all influence what is known, what is preserved, and what is valorized. So you have a lot of hands in this pot, and there's definitely competition. Now, there's also appropriation, misappropriation, and conflicts over what constitutes the Assyrian story. History is contested. Claims over the past sometimes overlap, conflict, or get reinterpreted. Some nations or regimes will claim ancient civilization, such as the image you see here, Saddam claiming himself as kind of an Assyrian or Babylonian monarch fighting the Iranians in this case, in this particular sketch. They reinterpret or downplay minority groups' claims to that ancient heritage. Supposedly, and I cannot find this in any source, but supposedly somebody had asked Saddam, well, what about the Assyrians of Iraq? And he allegedly responded, well, who do you think rules Iraq? So I am, in effect, an Assyrian, but these others are not Assyrian. And interestingly, in Iraq and Syria, you should know that ancient Assyrians had been referred to as Ashuriyin, okay? And modern Assyrians had been referred to as Athuriyin, so the TH sound versus the SH sound. The ancients, Ashuriyin, the moderns, Athuriyin. In Syria, it's the reverse. Athuriyin are the ancient Assyrians, it's more the national name, and Ashuri is largely the Church of the East. So what does that tell you? It tells you that this terminology is really or interrelated, including Suraya, including Syriac or Syriani. Reinterpret or downplay minority groups' claims to that ancient heritage. This is certainly done in Iraq in the case of the Assyrians, where oftentimes the reference made to ancient Assyrians was Iraqiyin al-Qudama, or ancient Iraqis. Use historical ties to justify political claims. The territory is contained within Iraq. Babylon is in Iraq, and Ashur and Nineveh are within Iraq now. Misappropriation can happen when national narratives claims or monopolize a history that minority communities also claim, sometimes denying them recognition or expression of that identity. That's what happened in Iraq. In Iraq, the Assyrians were not recognized as a full nationality. They were recognized as a ta'ifa, or a religious group. So, for example, when Mari Sheshimun was recognized the head of the Assyrians, we're talking about the head of the religious group of the Church of the East known as Assyrians. So how do Arab groups, who are the Arabs who kind of look to Assyrian history and reshape it? Sati al Husri was a nationalist, Arab nationalist. He was a principal ideologue of linguistic Arab nationalism. He held views that all Arabic-speaking peoples are Arabs, and even those who speak Arabic but deny their Arabic identity or Arab identity are Arab. His criterion for Arab identity was primarily language and association with Arabic speakers, not racial. Iraqi Ba'athists captured these ideas and pressed them from a more political perspective. And they reinterpreted Assyrian history. And they said, for example, the Assyrians were simply Arabs. They came from the Arabian Peninsula, therefore they are Arabs. The rationale was a strong national unity required minimizing ethnic linguistic divisions. Often the argument was that the ancient civilization, Assyria Babylon, could be claimed as part of the Arab heritage. And that is because, excuse me, they came from the Arabian Peninsula. Saddam promoted a narrative tying Mesopotamian ancient past to Arab nationalism. He used nationalist propaganda, monuments, state media, downplays, or ignores distinct language and cultural identity when inconvenient. So although we speak a different language, that's not that important. You know, you are from the Arabian Peninsula. In fact, in a meeting with an Assyrian group, I am told some of them are still alive, by the way, long time ago when the regime was still in power. They had met with Tariq Aziz, who was himself a member of the Chaldean Church and whose name was Mette Yuhanna or Yuhanna Mette, forget exactly, but it was known as Tariq bin Ziyad, the famous Arab conqueror. And he met this Assyrian group from the United States and he laid it out to them. He said, look, welcome, you know, to you, Assyrian Americans. I just want to tell you that, of course, you are from the Arab world. Your ancestors were basically tribes who moved from the Arabian Peninsula into what is Iraq today, or was known as Assyria. Local Arab nationalist intellectuals and education officials, among them Michel Aflaq, who was a Christian from Syria, co-creator of the Baath Party, a major ideologue, saw that Christian minorities were just as Arab as anybody else, and that their heritage should be assimilated. In census categories, of course, Assyrians should be classified as Arabs. These people who are educators use the fact that many Assyrians, especially urban multilingual families, speak largely Arabic, participate in Arab culture, and intermix with society as evidence that they are, in fact, Arabs. And I have to tell you, this was very, very effective. Had Iraq not fragmented into what it is today, many Assyrians in Iraq would simply claim that they are Arabs anymore, or from now on, because I had the experience of meeting many recent arrivals from Baghdad. And when you ask them, how would they classify their nationality? They just simply look you in the eye and say, well, Arab, of course. How else? And this came because there was a great deal of education and lack of education on the part of Assyrians telling their own story, but a greater effort being propagated by the state. And here we have Sati al Husri's quote, every Arab-speaking people is an Arab people. Every individual belonging to one of these Arab-speaking peoples is an Arab. And if he does not recognize this, and if he is not proud of his Arabism, Aruba, then we must look for the reasons that have made him take this stand. It may be an expression of ignorance. In that case, we must teach him the truth. So we must tell him the national story of what it is to be an Arab, which includes Assyrians, of course. It may spring from an indifference or false consciousness. Leftists love to say this word a lot. In that case, we must enlighten him and lead him to the right path. But under no circumstances should we say, as long as he does not wish to be an Arab, and as long as he is disdainful of his Arabness, then he is not an Arab. He is an Arab regardless of his own wishes, whether ignorant, indifferent, undutiful, or disloyal, he is an Arab. But an Arab without consciousness or feeling, and perhaps even without conscience, dhamir in Arabic. Now, What theory and precedent as to the national story suggests? A national story can include ancient civilizations that are geographically within the territory. So Iraqis, we're reaching kind of a middle ground here. Assyrians are, after all, belong to a land that is largely within Iraq, not exclusively, of course. We have Assyrians from Urmia, which is now in Iran. We have Assyrians from the Hakkari Mountains and the Tur Abdin area, which is now in Turkey. We have Assyrians from the Khabur area who have been there for a long time in the area of Syria, and other members of the Syriac Orthodox faith, Syriac Catholic faith, Chaldean faith, all living in one geographical area that has been split into various aspects. So we must understand that Iraq claims the Assyrian heritage, the artifacts, the material culture, as it were, and the Kurdistan region views it as one of its predecessors, as I said earlier. But including or emphasizing the ancient heritage doesn't necessarily give exclusive rights to these states. Assyrians can also claim descent, cultural link, or continuity, and doing so is part of their own identity and rights, especially when intertwined with languages, traditions, places, and names. Ankonaya, for example, Ninvaya, and so on and so forth. People belonging to that land and claiming and linking themselves to that land. Even many more ancient Assyrian names, for example, that have survived. Forbidding someone from speaking or claiming that heritage is problematic from both ethical, the right to cultural expression, and legal standpoints, international human rights norms. And this particularly was much more severe in Turkey, for example. Here you see a photograph. This is a very interesting photograph of the governor of Nineveh, who recently visited the British Museum, and he was given a gift. Now, he's fond of giving gifts to people who come visit Nineveh. I mean, he's the ruler of Nineveh now. He's the governor of this great state within Iraq, and he's fond of giving people gifts that are traditionally part of the ancient past of Nineveh, particularly Assyrian artifacts. He loves giving copies of Assyrian reliefs and so on, and he says, this is the land of the Assyrians, Bilad al-Ashuriyin, this is Bilad al-Ashur, and so on and so forth. And here he is in England, and he's receiving a copy of a book, The Assyrians, by a professor at the British Museum. So I thought this is a very interesting photo to share with you. Now, Assyrians is a minority in Iraq, an indigenous community that traces its lineage to ancient Assyria. That's how the Assyrians should be defined, and not as that Assyriologist put it, the community to which you belong. I'm interested in some other community. State behavior under Ba'athist regimes, Arabization policies pressured non-Arab minorities to assimilate, including reclassifying Assyrians as Arab Christians into Arab, simply. Suppression of their language, restriction of heritage, and identity practices. This was very severe in the 1970s in Iraq in particular, which, by the way, led to the rise of oppositional groups like the Assyrian Democratic Movement. Cultural heritage and archaeology is very important, paid less attention to this on the part of the Assyrians in the 70s and I would say in the 30s, 40s, and so on. Much more so the case now. The Assyrians are paying attention to their cultural objects. So objects of Assyrian civilization are physically located in Iraqi territory, for example, through state institutions. And Iraq sees itself as the inheritor of Mesopotamian civilization, which is Assyrian, Babylonian, and of course others. And there is tensions here. Assyrians criticize the state for not recognizing them as indigenous or for failing to allow them to claim the heritage as exclusively or primarily theirs. There are also grievances about land, naming, languages, and representation. And I want to tell you, you may see this as a strictly academic issue, but it's not. It's also an economic issue. These cultural artifacts are artifacts of value, and that includes economic value. So Do Assyrians have a claim to these artifacts, or do others who simply say, I am an Iraqi, therefore I have a claim? Now, can the Assyrians be part of the state and retain themselves as Assyrians and perhaps, for example, be in charge of tourism in Iraq to certain sites? Why not? Can Iraq forbid Assyrians from using or claiming the Assyrian Empire history legally and practically? So legally, under international law regarding minority rights, it cannot, and this law prohibits such expressions. Now, domestically in Iraq, that was certainly the case. Assyrians were not allowed to include themselves as part of ancient Iraqi history. Ancient Assyrians in Iraq were called oftentimes Iraqin al-Qudama, ancient Iraqis, rather than, as now, for example, the expression ancient Kurdistan is being used. But if this is done under current law, international law, and cultural rights, and so on, this is viewed as obviously very wrong and unjust. And it's not the case in Iraq anymore, certainly not overtly. Practically, even if a government tries to restrict people, often there are channels, diaspora, academia, private culture, and media that can preserve and promote the narrative. Fully suppressing it is hard, especially if tangible heritage remains, language, place names, monuments, and so on and so forth. Politically and symbolically, forbidding, for example, the Assyrians to use their heritage tends to increase the conflict or resistance and may delegitimize the state, as it did, I believe, in the case of Turkey, when it mistreated the Kurds and called them Mountain Turks and changed the names of many of the places that they reside. There was, of course, there was, a conflicting message coming from the people themselves. Now, in some cases, certain people may succeed. For example, who knows how the Palestinian situation fares these days? In the case of Armenians, for example, in living in Turkey, the state largely succeeded in kind of wiping out their history, but it cannot stop them from sharing their understanding of their culture and their former lands, for example, as in the case of the Assyrians living in the Hakkari Mountains, known as Nestorians for many Turkish scholars. Now, is it proper to include Assyria as, is it appropriate to include Assyria as part of a national history of Iraq? Yes, of course, from one perspective, because the lands of ancient Assyria, Nineveh, Nimrud, Dur Sharrukin, Erbil, all lie within the area of modern Iraq, and because much of the physical remains, archaeological and so on, are there. There's nothing inherently illegitimate about Iraq claiming this past as part of its heritage, but it becomes problematic if doing so, as Pierre pointed out in certain cases, the state denies or suppresses the particular identity of the Assyrians and treats them as, to be wiped out or to be erased, and not to use themselves as kind of a connection between ancient Assyria. Also problematic if the state tries to monopolize the historical narrative in such a way to exclude or punish, as was the case in Iraq for the Assyrians at a particular time in the 70s and 80s. There's also a concern about how modern Assyriologists disregard modern Assyrians as inheritors of their ancient civilization. This is definitely a concern in the West. Now, there are other examples. Of course, Macedonians and Greeks fight over, for example, the name of, Macedonia. Does it belong to Greece? Does it belong to Macedonia? And there was an agreement. I don't mean to go too much into this, but just to say that this happens a lot. There are histories that nations want to tell, and they are challenged by others. So this is a statue of Alexander the Great, for example, in Macedonia, where, does the heritage belong to Macedonia? It's a Slavic republic, or does it belong to Greece? And there is a dispute to this day. Assyrians and Armenians in Turkey, indigenous claims in various states, in Australia, Canada, and others, in New Zealand. This is often a topic of discussion. Now, in the Greek Macedonian case, there was a dispute and there was an agreement, Precipa agreement. It's a lake in Macedonia, and there was an agreement that all right, we will let Macedonia use that term. It's called the Republic of North Macedonia. Greece, of course, has its own Macedonia area, and so they made things somehow worked out. But I should tell you that although the elites were praised by European powers and the United States, the natives in both Macedonia and Greece kind of objected to this agreement. There's also, of course, the Egyptian past to talk about. The state has largely monopolized that. And the Copts, who are mostly focused on their religious particularities, I should say. Of course, the word Coptic is in Greek from the word Egypt. Ikopt is Egypt. And now there is much more of an understanding of the ancient past and a pride in this world where many ethnicities are becoming proud of their ancient history. There is much more pride in the ancient Egyptian past on the part of the Egyptians, but the state continues to claim ancient Egyptian culture and artifacts and museums and, of course, the pyramids and these great, immense sculptures and sites as its own and it's a great tourist business, and many non-Coptic people are involved in it. In Turkey, of course, there's suppression, denial, and reshaping of Ottoman and Anatolian history. The Assyrians are virtually erased among modern Turkish scholars. There are some bright spots here and there, but by and large, members of the Syriac Orthodox Church live in, I would say, a great deal of fear from the state of Turkey and are very docile when interacting with the government. And the Assyrians of the Hakkari area largely are gone and are referred to as Nestorians and Chaldeans, of course, according to church. But at no time does Turkey recognize the oneness of these people, that they were a people speaking this unique language and understanding them as a kind of a coherent nationality, along with the Kurds and the Armenians living in these areas. This is also an example in China and Tibet, the way China sees its history and the way it sees Tibet's history and Tibet's identity. And of course, that is rejected by many Tibetans. In Iran, of course, there is a great deal of discussion about Iranian history and the way it is understood. Some understand their Iranianness as simply being Persian, which is sort of inaccurate. So people from the northern places in Iran, although they speak Persian, of course, call themselves originally Persian, but they are, of course, of different Iranian groups, and there are many different Iranian groups. Persians are one prominent ethnicity or nationality within Iran. And Iran, one must understand, was really an empire that kind of shrunk from its original size into a smaller entity, but nevertheless, it's very diverse in terms of all its nationalities living there. So to recap, a national story is selective, publicly performed account of a people's past and identity used to bind a political community, legitimize rulers or territory, and define its membership. It's built by state institutions largely, schools, museums, monuments, the law, political elites, intellectuals, and the media. It is also contested and reshaped by Assyrians in their homeland and the diaspora and external scholars. So Iraqis see Assyrian history as one way. Assyrians all over the world see it as a different way. And oftentimes you do hear these expressions coming from Assyrians that, this is ours, this being the ruins, the cities, the names, the history, this is ours. It doesn't really belong to you, it belongs to us. Now, the consequences of appropriation and misappropriation, there's political exclusion and grievance when a state's narrative erases or reclassifies the Assyrian past. It creates social and political grievances, such as the example I gave you, the creation of the Assyrian Democratic Movement in 1979. Conflict or negotiated settlements, the Prosepa Agreement between Greece and Macedonia, or the Republic of Macedonia, formerly the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. These things are possible, but it wasn't really favored by most people, but it was pressed by the United States and others, the European Union. International human rights scrutiny, coercive erasure of a minority, of minority cultural memory draws criticism and may trigger sanctions, international legal claims, or NGO intervention. Now, a lot of this has to do with power, of course, and political influence. Now, implications for the state, the academy, and the Assyrian question. State can include ancient Assyria, as we said, in its national story. It is normal for a territorial state like Iraq, like Turkey, like Syria, to protect its archaeological heritage and to even advertise it. Exclusive monopolization or forbidding of minority claims or marginalizing the minority, the Assyrians, for example, is problematic and often unlawful. When a state actively prohibits Assyrians from claiming or commemorating their own past, it resembles the suppression seen in Turkey or the cultural assimilation seen in Tibet, as we gave that example. It also is the case with academics marginalizing Assyrians as belonging to, as we said, a separate community. Practical outcomes depend on institutions and power. The very realistic consideration. If states and institutions privilege a unitary Mesopotamian Iraqi story while marginalizing Assyrian language education, political representation, or cultural use of sites and names, then Assyrians will face de facto exclusion even without a formal ban. Historic injustice and dispossession complicate legitimacy if the state's narrative is used to erase prior settlement, land claims, or cultural continuity. Land claims such as, for example, in particular in the Kurdistan area, which is a hotly contested issue and is being debated as we speak, then the state's claim will be seen by minorities, by Assyrians, as appropriation or erasure. International norms and minority rights and precedent from other cases make such unilateral erasure contestable. Assyrians have a responsibility. I want to finally say this. Assyrians have a responsibility to learn, to study, to uphold, and to protect their heritage and collective history.